Continuing our talk now on the idea of ethnicity, so we looked at kind of the definitions of ethnicity in the first video, comparing that with the idea of race. We're going to rehash that a little bit here. And then we also looked at the locations of certain ethnic groups here in the US without really looking at the reasons behind that. So we'll throw in a little bit of that maybe in this video, but definitely in the next one if we don't get there. So what traits do people in these certain groups share? So we have ethnicity and race, which we've already defined. Ethnicity, again, cultural traditions coming from a cultural hearth. Okay, and race, the idea of the connection to a biological ancestor. All right, so we've kind of already talked a little bit about what those things have in common. Now, nationality is identity with a group of people who share a legal attachment and personal allegiance to a particular country. So this idea that, you belong to a certain country because you were born there or because you have moved there and you have gained citizenship, things like that. And so sometimes ethnicity and nationality can be the same thing, as we will see down the road, but in other times they can be very, very different, all right? Because of different categories and how people affiliate and associate themselves with, how do they see themselves, how do other people see them, all right? All get really, really complex when we take all this into account, as we will hopefully explain, right? Because nationalities can be made up of several different ethnicities. And we use the word races here because, some people still associate that with different races. But for our definitions, again, there's just one race, okay? So tying this into the idea of ethnic enclaves and locations is this, so we talked about, ethnic clusterings a little bit in the last video. We're kind of expanding on that here with the idea of ethnic enclaves and ethnoburbs and, other types of locations. So an ethnic enclave has a high concentration of an ethnic group that is distinct from those in the surrounding area. So typically this connects itself back to the idea of chain migration, where, you have people who are, either family members or have similar backgrounds, moving to the location where people who are like them, all right, because there is that sense of familiarity. There's a sense of shared culture, shared history between these people where they can feel comfortable and more aligned with, beliefs, practices, people like them. All right, and typically when we see ethnic enclaves, again, keyword here, typically, but you can see this in other places as well, are typically found or often found in large cities, and we see that cultural identification through cultural features like language, food, religion, art, styles of dress. So when you hear the words Chinatown or Little Italy, those are connections to ideas of ethnic enclaves. All right, and that can change as demographics change because not every place stays the same. So we're looking at a little bit here. And so we're looking kind of here. This is the idea. So this is the New York suburb. So we got the Bronx up here. We got Manhattan. This is Queens, and then, Brooklyn over here, and then, Staten Island isn't on this one, and I think that's okay. At least as far as I know, Staten Island, I don't see Staten Island on here. I think it's, a little bit far off. So you can kind of see the breakdown here, percentage of, white people in each area, Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx, African American, or Black, Asian, and then, people that are other, whether that means they're listed as other or as multiple. So you can kind of see Manhattan is predominantly white. Parts of Brooklyn, think Williamsburg in particular, predominantly white. But there are other neighborhoods that are predominantly African American. So this would be, up here is kind of Washington, Morningside Heights, which is right next to Columbia. And then the other actual neighborhoods, I don't really recall or really know them very well. But again, you can kind of see where they're clustered within there. Where's there one dominant group? And this is not by accident. Again, this is the idea of people moving together. Now, this could change as people move to different locations, and something that within a bit of a reckoning in terms of the understanding of that. So North Minneapolis, which is now predominantly African American, but also has a very, very large Hmong population too, used to be the location of Jews in the Twin Cities, or at least in the Minneapolis side of the Twin Cities, right? But that slowly changed from the 19-teens to the 1960s and 70s, where the Jewish population slowly moved out over time, and then by 1960, late 60s and early 70s, think about times during the Civil Rights Movement, the Jews had been anyway, in the idea of white flight, and had taken advantage of being able to leave the suburb or leave to the suburbs. All right, so that's an example because both my grandparents on my mother's side, born and raised in Minneapolis, both went to, at least my grandfather went at least to Minneapolis North. But again, the idea of, Jewish people on the north side of Minneapolis now would seem striking to people, but again, there's a different history to it. All right, and yes, racial prejudice was a very big reason for why Jews left the north side, but that's talking about changing demographics. All right, so those are things that we want to consider as well. And then also, what are other examples in Minnesota about where ethnic groups are located? Where have they been located previously? Where have they moved? Things like that. Consider that if you can. All right. So Chicago, and I don't even know where to begin breaking this down, or even doing an overlay because I don't know Chicago really well. I've only been there out in the city once, and it was for a wedding, and it was like negative 10 degrees out in the middle of January, and so I was probably outside for maybe 30, 40 minutes one time in the dark with my friends when we went out to get dinner the night before. But yeah, I don't really know Chicago all that well. Mr. Getz knows and loves Chicago. He knows this much better. But again, you can kind of see the overlay of changing, possibly of neighborhoods anyway, within, the different locations where groups are found. So here's 1950, and then 2000, the African American community kind of here. It's still, I think, fairly prevalent, still fairly similar. The color scheme isn't the same, which doesn't help. But kind of, I think, in this connection area where there wasn't a whole lot of, and maybe I'm reading this wrong, in terms of the location, African Americans kind of added a little bit more to this area. And then Hispanic, or, it technically says Mexican here. You kind of see very large numbers in like the Cicero neighborhood, Franklin Park, Bensonville. If you look on here, you see Mexican in red, and there's one pocket, and obviously that has, changed over time. So again, changing dynamics within the neighborhoods. Okay, so here is London. All right, so two different ways to see this within all the different locations. Are all of these different ethnic groups within the city of London itself, which is the largest ethnic group in each area, or migrant group, or another way of looking at it. So you don't necessarily see white, but you see a lot of them connected to the British Empire. Not all, but a lot, with Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, South Africa, Jamaica, a little bit of Nigeria in there, Ireland for sure. And you can kind of see that overlapping. Where are those ethnic enclaves? Again, in London, you can kind of see overlap of white, just the idea of white, and then also white British, who's considered British versus white Irish, right? Asian from India, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Caribbean, so that was Jamaican would play in that. Black African, so coming like Nigeria and a few other places in Africa, and then other people from like other parts of the Arab world. So you can kind of see, again, them clustered in various different locations throughout the city. And again, that probably is connected to, what they can afford, but also who's living where. Where do you feel comfortable? All right. So you can kind of see those populations, majority and minority. Then we also get ethnoburbs. So if ethnic enclaves are locations within a city, ethnoburbs are suburbs with a cluster of a particular ethnic population. So this is outside the main city into the surrounding areas. Okay. Oftentimes this happens in the United States as European immigrant descendants have moved to the suburbs. The idea of white flight, which we'll define here in a sec. But you can see that with immigrant groups today. Cicero, Illinois, again, you can kind of see, here, I don't know if Cicero's is actual, it might just be, I don't know if that's part of Chicago or just an outlying, well, I think it's actually a different city, being predominantly Mexican. I think the book actually defines what Cicero was, but if you kind of look over here, I think Cicero might have been a Jewish neighborhood. I don't really remember. I think the book says it. But anyway, you can kind of look that up. But also, St. Louis Park is predominantly, a Jewish suburb here, or not predominantly. That's where a lot of Jewish people do live in, the western side of the Twin Cities. But obviously, that's not the only group that is there. All right, but if there was an ethnic enclave of Jewish people in one location in the Twin Cities, that'd be the main hub of a suburb. But they're also, located in Edina and Plymouth and Minnetonka and, Richfield, Bloomington, just everywhere. But again, if you're looking for a large concentration, St. Louis Park would be an example. All right, now comparing it within Europe. So in the United States, suburbs are usually considered more white, while the inner cities and downtowns are typically heavily diverse and also have high populations of non-white people. All right. The downtown, anyway, is more white than non-white, actually, but the areas around the downtown, not so much. In Europe, however, it's very much the opposite. Cities are heavily white and European, but typically the suburbs are the ones that are for immigrant groups of varying ethnicities and are typically often the poorer areas. So it's actually kind of a little bit of an interesting reverse comparing Europe to the United States. And we'll talk about this. We'll re-bring this back up in near the end of the course, actually, when we talk about services, settlements, and urban patterns. But again, this is something to consider. Other than major cities. Most of Europe is kind of like this. The cities are white, not all that diverse, and the suburbs are the more diverse areas and typically have the more ethnic populations and are the poorer areas. So interesting little switch. Then looking at Brazil and Guyana, Guyana being up here, not French Guiana, but just the country of Guyana itself, which are two separate ones. And Brazil, looking at the idea of racial identity and ethnicity. So you can kind of see here in Brazil, areas that are predominantly white, okay, and then brown and mixed, and you got a few areas of red that are considered to be black or African, and some indigenous pockets and some Asian pockets as well. So, just like in the United States, immigration and marriage shape our diverse backgrounds, okay? Especially through census data, it limits how people categorize themselves because of how they identify. So you kind of see in the book on page 280 the idea of the census versus how people self-identify based on, well, what if I don't consider myself that, or there's no category that I think would fit me? All right, that's why, fill in the bubbles don't always actually work. Some people would prefer to just write out what they consider themselves to be as a more accurate statement versus, what someone else is providing. All right, now, within both countries, okay, this is Brazil and the United States, okay, regions are, Brazil and Guyana, not Brazil and the United States. Regions are clustered by ethnicities. As we can see here with this map of Brazil, we'll see Guyana on the next page. And that's related to two things. Voluntary migration from Europe, so potentially Guyana from England, I believe. I could be wrong on that. But Brazil for sure, Portugal. Okay. Then you also have forced migration from Africa and from India that forced colonization, slavery, and things like that, as well as the decimation of indigenous populations. All right. Hence why you see a large percentage of white people. All right. Then you see what you consider brown mix being, combination of that. Because when the Portuguese came in, they essentially established their own system, forced essentially slavery on the indigenous populations, and then diseases and the overworking and slavery decimated their numbers. And they brought in Africans as slaves to replace them, and also mixed marriages, things like that. Set up this whole system of different racial categories and ethnicities, or racial. I shouldn't say ethnicities, but definitely racial statuses or ethnic statuses within that. All right. So you can kind of see that a little bit differently here in Guyana. Okay. Where the vast majority of people per square mile. Okay, they're on the coastline. That touches itself going into this river over here, but also right out into the Atlantic Ocean. All right, and so a lot of them, a very large percentage of Guyana, when we looked at that religion map worldwide, Hindu. This explains it. East Indian, predominantly found, in these locations, kind of near or around the capital, like New Amsterdam, around Georgetown, and a few other places. You can kind of see where there is, African and African mixed majorities, and then areas that are fairly unpopulated. All right, so much of Guyana, kind of on the interior, isn't that heavily populated. All right, as we can see, again, number of people per square mile. All right, the vast majority of the population, East Indian, so again, India, African and Black, a little bit American Indian, all right, so indigenous peoples, and then mixed. So again, that connects itself over to the idea of power, wealth, who has it, who's located where. All right, same thing here, within the populations of like Rio and Sao Paulo and Brasilia. All right, connect themselves over to, where are people? And then you get other places like we'll refer to the idea of, again, white flight and changing demographics, like down here in Santa Clara, okay? From 2000 to 2010, you can kind of see this shift away from white and African American to Hispanic and Asian, all right? So things change. So in the next video, why ethnicities have distinctive distributions. That's what we'll talk about next time.